Hey guys, I'm Jordy, and this is your guide to the hardest encounter in all of Cataclysm, the notorious Spine of Deathwing.
Your armor means nothing. Your faith, even less.
Now, Spine of Deathwing is a difficult encounter, yes, but really with some proper planning, good burst DPS, and a few small tricks that I'll share in a second, this fight is very manageable. It's just a matter of priorities and everyone doing their job and not drifting to focus the wrong thing. Alright, so as this fight isn't just kill boss from 100% to 0, let's talk about the goal. As our goal is to take Deathwing out, but since he's a massive, nearly incomprehensible dragon, we're looking to weaken him by ripping the Elementium reinforced armor plates fused to his back off so that he becomes vulnerable to our attacks. To do this, we'll need to kill burning tendons, little connective tissue under the armor, and by doing so, this rips the plate off and allows us to continue up the back to the next one. You'll need to rip 3 plates off to complete the encounter, or kill 3 of these burning tendons, whilst managing a host of adds, which are pretty much Deathwing's immune system, and preventing him from rolling you off of his back with proper placement and a few tricks. Okay. So let's get into it. As far as raid comp, you'll want to 6 heal and 3 tank this. Yes, 3. As the tier goes on, you could drop to 2, but I recommend 3 early on. And a prot warrior or prot paladin are especially strong with this, which we'll talk about later. Just start planning to have one of your DPS warriors work on their LFR gear and get comfortable with kiting and tanking. We also recommend all of your mages spec Arcane, as their burst DPS cooldowns line up really well with the timing on the burning tendons being vulnerable. This isn't required once your DPS is high enough, but early on you'll find it very helpful. Note that in this video, on this first week of launch, we ran 9 Arcane mages. I get it, 95% of raids won't be able to manage this, just get a bit of gear and this won't be required. Okay, let's get into the specific things that you'll be contending with. As the fight begins, you'll be deposited on Deathwing's back and be surrounded by 4 adds simply named Corruption. These tentacle things spawn at fixed points on Deathwing's back. In this first section, just these 4 points, but once the first plate is removed, another 2 spawns are added, and then another 2 later for the final section. They've got about 2.5 million HP and cast 2 abilities. First, they'll apply a debuff to a random raid member every so often called Searing Plasma. This absorbs 420,000 healing and will deal 12,000 physical damage to the afflicted player every 10 seconds. The goal here is for your healers to heal this debuff off quick enough that any subsequent damage doesn't kill them. Absorbs do prevent damage while this is on somebody, so a well-timed power word shield could save them, but the goal is to get it off quickly. Additionally, they'll cast Fiery Grip on 3 random players, stunning the afflicted player until 375,000 damage is done to the corruption, snapping it out of its cast and freeing the players. More on that in the walkthrough, but the goal here is, unless you're just outright killing the corruptions, you want to do just enough damage to it to snap the players out of the stun without doing any additional damage. Okay. So we kill the corruptions. When one dies, in its place, a few things happen. First, each and every time a corruption dies, a big elemental add called a Hideous Amalgamation will spawn. These are the things that we'll be looking to use to explode on the plate and expose the burning tendon. Additionally, where the corruption was, will now periodically spawn burning bloods. These little guys have normal aggro tables, but not a ton of HP. Your add tank should pick them up and drag them toward the plate and tank them while your DPS kills them with various cleaving abilities. When they die, they explode, doing a bit of damage to the raid, but more importantly, they leave behind a little burning essence. Now, if you drag the Hideous Amalgamations, those big elementals I talked about a second ago, over those little burning piles, it will infuse the amalgamation with energy, increasing the Hideous Amalgamation's damage by 10% and attack speed by 20% per stack, up to 9 stacks. Upon reaching 9 stacks, it becomes superheated, dealing a ton of AoE damage to the raid until it dies. Upon its death, it will cast Nuclear Blast, a 5-second cast that if you stand too close will one-shot you, but more importantly, if it's close enough to the plate, as seen here, it will force off Deathwing's armor and expose the tendon, allowing us to finally damage it. So, what we're looking to do is DPS the amalgamation and the bloods, and when there's 9 piles of bloods on the ground that we've killed, we'll quickly drag the low HP amalgamation over the piles, allowing it to hoover up their essences until it reaches 9 stacks, then quickly kill the amalgamation where we want it to die and expose the plate and burning tendon, where we'll blast it with DPS until the tendon finishes its cast and yanks the plate back down, or it dies. Other than that, we've got a few small extra mechanics to think about. Every time an amalgamation spawns, it will throw out a 15-second debuff on a random raid member called Blood Corruption Death. This is a magic debuff that, if allowed to tick to 0, will explode the entire raid in raid wiping amounts of damage. In order to prevent that, we'll be looking to dispel it. When it's dispelled, it will jump to another raid member and retain the exact same amount of time it had remaining on that previous member, but on the new one. So, if we dispel it with 12 seconds remaining, the new raider will have 12 seconds on their debuff. But every time we dispel it, there is a chance the debuff changes from Blood Corruption Death to Blood Corruption Earth. So, we'll dispel this debuff, allowing it to bounce around until we see it goes from red to yellow. Once it's yellow, it will no longer wipe the raid, and if allowed to expire on a raid member, it will place a buff on that person, reducing their damage taken by 40% for the remainder of the encounter. The tooltip here says it stacks, but it will always be 40%, just trust. One thing about this, it seems that when the debuff jumps from one player to another, it will prioritize players on the opposite side of the spine that the initial player was. And as we're looking to give our tanks the yellow buff because they're the ones that take the most damage, we try to position them across the spine as these debuffs go out so that we can force the yellow buff on them instead of just relying on RNG to get them there. Super useful if done correctly. And finally, the roll mechanic. Deathwing doesn't love that you're on his back, so he'll sometimes try to roll you off of him by doing big turns in the air. If your raid is all stacked on one side of the room, he'll roll you, knocking the entire raid off of his back. To prevent this, we make sure to keep 1 or 2 people on each side of the spine so as to balance out the raid. All it takes is one person on the opposite side of the room that the raid is on. However, occasionally, we'll want Deathwing to roll, because when he does, he'll also knock off all of the hideous amalgamations that have spawned on his back, and sometimes we want to clear the room of the extra ones. More on that in the walkthrough, but when we want him to, we want to prevent the raid from also getting rolled, so we'll look to all stand in one of the small holes that the corruption tentacles spawn in. When you stand here, the fires of Deathwing will grip you with grasping tendrils, doing about 6,000 fire damage a second, and also reducing your movement speed, but also preventing you from being chucked off his back. This is super handy, and we'll talk about the cadence of this in a second. Finally, as you kill hideous amalgamations to expose the burning tendons, you'll get a debuff on the entire raid called Degradation, reducing the entire raid's HP by 5% per hideous amalgamation killed. This means that as the fight goes on, the raid's HP will get whittled down 5, 10, up to 30% HP at the very end of the fight, making everything more dangerous. So those last few tendon burn phases become quite scary. Phew, okay, so that is all of the mechanics. I know it was a lot. Let's get into the walkthrough to see how it plays out and the cadence of the fight. Alright, so we talk to the NPC on the ship here and begin the encounter. The entire raid will parachute from above Deathwing and land on his back, surrounded by 4 corruptions. We'll look to kill 3 of these right off the bat. We elect to do the right ones and then the back left one. Additionally, if the front left one starts casting Fiery Grip, a handful of players assigned to it, about 5, should cast single target instances of damage quickly into it, breaking that 375,000 damage threshold. Alright, so the first 3 corruptions die and the tanks pick up the amalgamations. Now we've got 3 of these things, but that's way too many, so we'll look to roll these off. The entire raid shifts to the left, stands in the hole where the corruption died, and Deathwing will roll. The adds should get chucked off of his back, while the raid stays comfortably planted because of the fiery tendrils. Once the roll is done and the adds are off, the raid should quickly shift back to the center of the room so as to not initiate another roll. Healers note that we'll have 3 Blood Corruption Death debuffs out about this time. Try to get them swapped to the yellow versions and onto your tanks by getting the tanks to the opposite side of the room, somewhere around here. It's fiddly, but you can do it. Okay, so now we've got no amalgamations. We'll kill that 4th corruption and spawn a fresh one. This is the one that we're going to be using to blow the plate up. The raid should start to DPS it hard while your main tank picks it up, and your off tank should start looking around the room and grabbing any bloods that are spawning and tank them nearby. But not on top of the amalgamation. It's crucial that the amalgamation not pick up any bloods until you're ready to kill it, as its damage will go up considerably. So you only want to let it absorb them once it's about to die to minimize its DPS on the raid and the tank. Additionally, as you kill that last corruption, a new one will spawn. There will always be at least 1 corruption tentacle up in the room. Every so often, it will cast a new fiery grip on 3 raid members. Have your assigned team blast it without dotting it and breaking the grips, but only doing so much damage as you have to interrupt it. You want to be careful because if it dies early, it will lead to an extra amalgamation. Ideally, you want it to die during the burning tendon burn phase so that it doesn't grip you in the middle of the most important DPS window. We'll see more of that in a second. Okay, so you've killed 9 bloods, their essences are in a neat pile, and the amalgamation is pretty low. We'll now call for the tank to run over the piles, hoovering up their essences, and the tank will pop a big defensive cooldown as well, as right as the amalgamation gets to 9 stacks, the raid will use a big defensive cooldown. We like Barrier or SLT, Rally is good too, and heal through that pulsing damage. The tank needs to make sure the ad dies close to the plate on the side that you intend for the tendon to appear, and then as it dies, it will cast Nuclear Blast. Upon the completion of the cast, the plate will expose the burning tendon. Now this is that all-important burn phase, and everyone, ideally healers included, need to do as much damage in the 20-second window as possible to it. The fight is tuned in such a way that these things need to die in 2 burn windows each, or you'll be overwhelmed by spawning ads, debuffs, and the like. So pop big cooldowns here and look to take it down to sub 50% in that first burn window. Once the tendon completes its cast and reseats the armor back on Deathwing, we've got a fresh amalgamation from the corruption that we likely just killed, and we'll be looking to kill bloods and DPS it low again. We push it to 5%, the tank hoovers up the corpses of the bloods, big raid cooldown again to prevent the 9 stacks of the amalgamation from killing us like AM or Barrier, and boom, the plate goes up, we kill the tendon, and expose the next section of Deathwing's back. From here, the fight just repeats, except now we have 2 more areas where corruptions can spawn. As each plate is removed, a new set of corruptions will also spawn, so we'll do exactly what we did at the start of the fight. Kill all of them except 1, drag the set of amalgamations that we don't want over to the hole where one of the dead corruption tentacles are, initiate Deathwing to roll and dump the extra amalgamations off, and then leave the hole as it does damage while we're in it, and then kill that final corruption, spawning a fresh amalgamation. And that's the cadence of the fight. Some things to note as the fight goes on, since the bloods spawn from the holes where the corruptions are, and as the fight goes on, there will be more and more holes, the speed of the bloods spawning will go up considerably toward the end of the fight. As such, especially as you're working on that final plate, your off tank will be completely overwhelmed by bloods at a certain point, and will need to kite them around to avoid getting destroyed by these things. We like to use a second ad tank toward the end of the fight to help relieve the ad tank somewhat while having them both kite. It just gives them a bit of breathing room, and then have them kite in a box formation around the spine. Using leaps, roars, shield walls, and shockwaves or stuns on the bloods help the tanks as they move around the room to avoid the brunt of the bloods' attacks. This is a tough job, but it is super important. Additionally, we opt to use our Lust on the final tendon in the first burn window, as the raid damage is the highest during this section, and everyone has their hands pretty full with all of their duties here. The Lust helps the healers catch up, DPS to ensure the burn window is successful for this tendon, and more, so consider that. If you survived the onslaught of ads, dispelled debuffs correctly, lined up your cooldowns appropriately, and have the DPS capable of burning those tendons down in 2 burn windows each, You'll rip that armor off of Deathwing, and he'll crash into the ocean a defeated dragon. Die!
Yep.
Die!
We're good. We're good.
Die! Fuck yeah!
I'm taking them all the way to the back.
Yes!
Hell yeah.
No way.
Hey, really good job, Tanks, on the job switch.
Woo! Congratulations on defeating the hardest boss in Cataclysm. Only one more to go. Alright, let's talk about some tank tips. This is a tough fight. There's a lot going on for you to manage between positioning the amalgamations, the blood corpses, your cooldowns during high damage windows, and kiting those adds when they become absolutely overwhelming. So plan ahead on where you need to be and where your cooldowns will be most effective. When the burning tendon is up and you've got nothing really else to do, consider throwing in your DPS, if you can, to the tendon or the corruption that you might have to kill off to prevent a grip in that burn window. If the DPS did their job correctly, it should have about 100k HP left in this window, so try to kill it to prevent that final cast of grip that could hinder your DPS's ability to get the necessary damage done on the tendon. Additionally, for the kiters, this job is hard, but it's very manageable. I'm going to link a guide from Cow, who plays with the guild who made a great kiting guide for this fight, as he can go into more detail there than I have time for here in the description below. Helpful for those tanks in particular. And for the healers, this fight is a lot. Make sure to plan cooldowns for the rolls, each nuclear blast, and watch those tanks' HP as their damage taken goes up toward the end of the fight. That stacking HP reduction really impacts their ability, so roll pain sups, sacks, whatever you have to keep them up. We use SLT and or barrier for each roll and nuclear blast. Make sure they're down as the mechanic lands and not after, as you'll miss a big portion of the damage if it's done late. And if you have the ability, help DPS those tendons. It's really impactful getting any extra healer DPS on them, and can be the difference between 2% on the tendon as it despawns or killing it. So do what you can to help out with the DPS on them. And for the DPS, you want to spec and reforge whatever you have to enable as much burn DPS in that 20-second window. Look at your trinkets, cooldowns, potions, anything you can to juice your numbers here. And for the team on the corruptions, watch your damage on them. The fiery grip is on a timer, so you can precast, and if done correctly, just before the cast goes out to get it to break faster, and make sure not to use dots, fire elementals, any AoE damage. Literally just be super careful and only do whatever damage is necessary to break the fiery grip, and then hard stop that damage. And do your best to do enough damage to break that grip before the first tick of damage goes out. If the grip is done to the people already afflicted with the healing soaking debuff, it can be tough to keep them up, so watch it. Alright, well, that is it for Spine of Deathwing. If you enjoyed this video, do me a huge favor and like and subscribe. We're almost done now, so stay tuned for Madness of Deathwing coming very soon. Thanks so much, guys, and I will see you in the next one.